Ignacio Grau. I'm the director of OIDEL. I'm going to be introducing an interesting panel that we are going to have on educational pluralism. Before to tell you some more about the menu we have, I want to start by thanking Verus for co-hosting this event and for helping us to make this happen. I also want to thank the UNESCO Commission of the Netherlands for being with us today and join us in this important conversation. I want to thank all the speakers and especially the MPs also that are with us, showing that this is not just a matter of the civil society, but it has strong political implications. Also, before to start, I want to say we have a photographer. If someone don't want to appear in the pictures, contact Caroline so we make sure like we delete you as in the USSR. Okay. So, today we are in The Hague to talk about educational freedom with one aim: to learn and to get inspired. Why are we doing that here? In 1917, Dutch people decided to include in their constitution the Article 23, which says all persons shall be free to provide education without prejudice to the authorities, right to supervision, and with regard to freedoms, with regard to forms of education designated by law. Not only that, I think it's interesting because the Dutch people realized at that point that without public resources, that right recognized in the Constitution wouldn't have been a right, it would have been a privilege of those with enough resources. The Dutch people and the Netherlands have been pivotal in the defense of educational pluralism. We have seen that in the influence of the Dutch Constitution and many other constitutions, but more important, in 1946, when the first draft of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there was not an article talking neither about parents, neither about educational pluralism. However, thanks God, we have one guy called Mr. Balfour, who was the head of delegation of the Dutch mission in these conversations. And he said, listen, we just have had the Second World War, and we know that if parents are not in power, if they cannot choose the education they want for their children, education can be not a human right, but a source of indoctrination. And because of that, today we have in the in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 26.3, which says parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. When I was a child, my teachers used to go to Finland to learn about education. And today people go to the Netherlands. I think it's great. Like we are coming to the Netherlands to learn about educational pluralism, and in a world that is becoming more plural, to show like a plural educational system also can exist and can happen. In these noisy and challenging times, it urges to recall one thing: we cannot take freedoms for granted. None and nobody can take freedoms for granted. Today we are here to observe what we have achieved around the world, inspired by this Article 23 of the Dutch Constitution and by this Article 26.3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Today we are here also to see the future, see how freedom and how pluralism have been pivotal for a democratic society as the Dutch one, but also how can we implement that and how can we make this happen around the world. Specifically, freedom of education is a contested right. Like that's why we have people from all around the world today joining us in this important forum. We see that at the political level and in many different forms: funding, curriculum, even violence in some countries. OIDEL was founded 40 years ago to fight for this right. A group of politicians at the European Parliament, in the moment that it seemed that it was a calm world, they say, this might be a contested right in the future. We need to create an institution to advocate for that. The right, freedom of education and educational pluralism is a good indicator of the trust of governments on their citizens. Like when freedom of education is not respected, we can drop a red flag. You know, this is something is going wrong. not only about the citizens, because this is not a right of Catholic schools or Protestant schools, this is a right of the citizens, this is a right of the minorities, and this is a right that enables us to see how countries acknowledge pluralism. I'm going to stop here, because you're going to hear way more from me later, so don't worry about that. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we are going to see here today, before to give the floor to GC and to Josiane. We are going to have one first panel in which the UNESCO responsible of educational policies is going to do an introduction. GC, he could not be with us today because, as we are talking, UNESCO is having their board meeting to choose the new Secretary General, so that was a valid excuse not for being here. Then Josiane is going to give us some of the highlights of the Freedom of Education Index that we have produced in order that we can have a little bit of the landscape of this freedom. Then we are going to have some reflections of Mark, books from Verus, Harvard Proof, from the Christian Democratic Appeal, and Don Cedar from the Christian Union. Then we are going to have some experts on to understand what's right about the Dutch educational system. We are going to coffee break, and after that we are going to have 3 international experts, Ashley Berner, Arja Krauchenberg, and Jan de Groof, to explain us the extent and the scope of educational pluralism. We're going to have a plenary discussion and then some closing remarks with the president of Verus and the president of OIDEL, and then lunch, and whoever has to go to the airport, just run. With that being said, I'm going to give the floor to GC, who's going to join us online. I think we have that. Can you tell me? Sorry, Josiane.
It is a pleasure for me to begin this. Thank you, dear Ignacy, distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues. It is a pleasure for me to begin this event on an important subject with the opening remarks. Educational pluralism is meant to acknowledge the diverse needs of learners and enable flexible and appropriate educational options. By allowing different models to coexist, it can ensure that all individuals benefit from education and learning opportunities that are relevant to their needs, fostering innovation and meeting the challenges of today's world. Through its initiative on the evolving right to education, UNESCO is calling for an adequate legal and policy framework that strengthens state responsibility while respecting diversity and ensuring accessible, inclusive, and quality education for all. As education systems become increasingly diversified with non-state actors, homeschooling, and faith-based and community-based services taking a great role, it is important to acknowledge the complexities and implications of this shift. As highlighted in the Geneva Dialogue on Human Rights and Education, organized in June 2024, educational pluralism highlights the interplay between public and non-state providers, which should be supported by appropriate legislation and regulatory practice. However, the growing diversity must be accompanied by robust state capacity and oversight to safeguard rights and equity. Educational pluralism does not mean educational relativism. States remain the primary duty bearers under international human rights law, with a clear responsibility to uphold minimum quality standards, prevent discrimination, and ensure inclusive access and prioritize child well-being across learning environments, including those beyond traditional school systems. This is further emphasized in UNESCO's recent research and advocacy. UNESCO's research on the evolving right to education emphasizes the need for an updated international legally binding framework that aligns with today's rapidly changing educational landscape. Such a framework must clarify the accountability and the regulation of non-state actors in education, reaffirm the role of public authorities in guaranteeing educational quality, equality, and equity, and expand the legal recognition of learning beyond schooling, including non-formal pathways. A rights-based approach to educational pluralism must uphold critical legal principles as outlined in our report on non-state actors published last year. These principles include prioritizing the best interest of the child, recognizing the right of parents and legal guardians to choose the type of education their children receive, and ensuring that regulations support educational pluralism, with governments taking a participatory approach when shaping this regulation. Educational pluralism, when paired with state responsibility and shared accountability, has the potential to strengthen both educational and democratic outcomes. School systems that offer a range of educational options perform well when all are held to common standards for academic quality and citizenship. This perspective is further supported by research from Ms. Ashley Berner and other experts who will intervene later in this discussion today. Recognizing the increasing diversity of educational systems, there is a need for a regulatory framework that supports educational pluralism while upholding quality, equity, and the right of all learners. Such an approach ensures coherence and collaboration across different forms of education and reinforces the critical responsibility of state in safeguarding the right to education throughout life. In conclusion, let us work together to ensure that educational pluralism fosters equitable, inclusive, and quality education as a right for all. I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Shishi, and I'm going to give the floor now to Josiane Singh. For those who are not familiar with Josiane, she's our policy officer. She has co-authored the Freedom of Education Index with Micah San Andres and myself. You see, she looks sweet, but you don't want to have her in front when discussing about freedom of education because she's a fierce expert about this issue. And Josiane, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let's see, I have a little presentation. Oh, that's too much. No, you see the whole thing, it's fine. Okay. So, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming and for your interest. We are based in Geneva, so we work in our little office sometimes, and it's good to sometimes come into the world and see that we're not the only ones interested in this topic and working in this topic and working for freedom of education. As Ignacy mentioned, freedom of education has started in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There it's the basis, and from there then there was treaties come out of the binding treaties where states committed to freedom of education. And then our question was, so it's good that they committed to it, but how does it look like in reality? Do states follow through with their commitment? Are they really protecting freedom of education as they should? And so to answer this question, we established the Freedom of Education Index, the book Ignacy showed before, and so I'm gonna quickly highlight some points. The goal of this small presentation is not to show everything of the book. We are here to understand the Dutch case, but still I think it helps to have some, just to give some insight into this report. And of course you can find it online as well. So I'm just gonna I want to just highlight 4 things. One is just the overall state of situation and the tendencies of the last year. And then I'm gonna focus on 2 of the indicators we have analyzed. The first one being legal recognition in the different countries, and then public funding for non-governmental schools. And 4th, I'm gonna give a little bonus insight as well. So, starting with the general trends. This is the book that we did. That's the 2024 report. However, this is not the first time we do it. We already did one in 2016. We also did one in 2002. And of course, that's interesting that this allows us to see the tendencies over the last 20 years. And what we found is this, that overall freedom of education is slightly in a better place than in 2016 or 2002. This is a good tendency. However, as you can see in every region of the world, we're still far from what would be ideal. Our job is done once every region is on 100 points. We are not there yet. And you also can see that in Europe and North America and Oceania is the regions where freedom of education is the best protected. And then in the Northern Africa, Western Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, it's where it is the least protected at the moment. But the general tendency is upwards. And so to get to that index, again, we looked at different indicators, and one of them being a legal recognition. Do states, or is freedom of education recognized in national laws? Overall, the answer is yes. In almost all countries, freedom of education is legally recognized. We were very generous in our interpretation. So some laws talk about freedom of education, other talk about the rights of parents to choose, other talk about the existence of private schools. So any of these mentions, we took it and we interpreted it as a yes. There's always an exception, several exceptions. There's 3 countries in the world that explicitly prohibit freedom of education. Any guesses? North Korea?
Greece.
No.
Afghanistan?
There are some. It's not that red. There's another one. It's like not like North Korea, like really. Cuba, exactly Cuba, and surprisingly North Macedonia as well. These are the bad examples. There are other 3 where it's practically impossible, being Eritrea, Saudi Arabia, and Afghanistan. Yeah.
There's one thing. We have the MP that will have to leave. So we're gonna steal more of his time. I'm happy because we are gonna hold now that you are really attentive. We're gonna have Mr. Don Seder can join us for an opening statement. Sorry, we have to do that after, but we'd rather to hear him now than not hear him at all. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much. And I did not know about North Macedonia, so we'll see how we can tackle that from the Dutch Parliament to see how they can cooperate more when it comes to pluralism on an educational level. My name is Dan Sierra. I'm a member of Parliament. I have to be in a debate in a few minutes, so thank you for granting me the floor. I'm so excited to see a lot of people. Like you mentioned, sometimes it feels like it's a lone battle, but to see people from different countries, that's very exciting, and also it's very motivating. Like was mentioned in the Dutch Constitution, we made sure that freedom of education is a constitutional right, and I think it revolves around the question: who do schools, not education, but who do schools belong to? Is it the state, or is it the community, the parents? Because that matter, how you answer that, decides how you look into education, and whether if it's a state matter, and or whether it's something that it's a right that the state needs to provide. But it's up to parents, it's up to communities, it's up to people that are willing to build schools, how you provide the educational level. That's a very big ideological debate, which we also have in this parliament, because while it's a constitutional right, every single year liberal parties try to demolish that, which is kind of strange, because liberalism comes from the idea of individual freedom, also in the public square. But when it comes to educational purposes, we do see liberal parties taking the front seat when it comes to attacking the constitutional right of freedom of education. And for us as a Christian, it's very important that the public square is also a square where different ideas have a space to contend for it's a battle of ideas, and schools are places where ideas are formed, where children are raised, where those ideas can be of a place where it can be developed. So it's very important that freedom stays and remains protected. One of the biggest misconceptions I hear from people that are propagating education level where the state sides is because it becomes neutral education. I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions I ever heard, because there's no such thing as neutral education. Even if you would ask the government to provide education, the neutrality of a government needs to be firmly debated, and also comes from a very firm and strict ideology about how society, families, schools, and children should be raised. So that notion where a lot of parties in the parliament try to implement or try to change the constitutional right of freedom of education because they want a more state neutral version of education. To me, that's something that I will keep fighting and continue to keep fighting because it's an ideological mistake. Schools education is about freedom of thought, freedom of ideology, and it's up to a country, it's up to people, it's up to communities to do that in a very, of course, conscientious way, but they do have a freedom to raise, to direct the schools in the way that they want. So although we have a constitutional right, it is a parliamentary discussion, and it's also based on some false premises, which we will continue to fight and debate. One of the things I would like to say before I leave is that one of the arguments that we also hear is that although freedom of education should be legalized and it should be protected by the state, it's also a matter, it raises the question if the state should fund that. I know in some of the countries that's not the case. For me also that's a false premises, because every citizen that follows a form of education, it is a taxpayer, and funding by state concerning schools is being done by the same taxes that people that are on a non-governmental school are also, those are taxes that are also being raised by them. So I think it's a more equal way than having a system where you have private schools because they're not conforming towards what the state feels that education should look like. We do find quality very important. So how we divide it in the Netherlands is that the government decides what is taught on school. So what are the end goals that we find important that a child should learn before they reach a certain age, but the how, through which lens, through which perspective, that's up to the schools. And if they manage to do that in a qualitative, good way, the government should back down and not have any say on how. It's not surprising to me that the schools where the freedom of education is being has its place, and where schools are founded because of a certain ideological, maybe a Christian perspective. When you look in the Netherlands, even when it comes to homeschooling, those students are and those schools in general are the best performing schools in the country. So I do also like to make a claim that there where freedom of education has its place, there where people, students, teachers, and parents come together and educate from a certain ideological perspective, it creates a synergy that actually leads to better educational results. So I will keep promoting freedom of education. I will keep fighting false premises that states that neutrality is the important factor. There's no such thing as neutrality when it comes to education. And I would like to say thank you for being here. Thank you for learning. We're also learning from you. And hopefully we can all contribute each in our own way to ensuring and also bringing further freedom of education wherever we are. Thank you, and God bless you.
Great, thank you so much. We're doing a bit of a remix. this morning. So we were here, no? With the Great. I will get back to the Dutch constitution in a moment. But let's have a look, because now we're going to talk about funding. So funding for non-governmental schools, that has been mentioned, is crucial for freedom of education. Freedom of education. Because if the state doesn't fund the non-governmental education, then the financial burden ultimately lays on the parents, and not all parents can afford to pay education for their children, which then makes freedom of education a privilege, another right, which what it should be. Another way to pose the funding question then, because of that, is this: in how many countries do parental choices not depend on family income? Or else put, how many countries fully fund non-governmental schools? The answer is 7. Here are 3 of them: Netherlands, Belgium, and Finland. Now, this is very good. Now, Netherlands. I felt like it was almost a bit of an understatement what he did. So the Netherlands, one of only very few countries, fully funds non-governmental schools. And what's very special about the country as well is that non-governmental funding for non-governmental schools is in the constitution. This is, together with Slovenia, the only country that does that. So that means that the Netherlands is the only country that fully funds non-governmental schools and has public funding in the constitution, which makes it a very strong case, and a case to follow. That's the main point. A bit more details on funding in other countries. This is the overview. Just some points here. 22%. This is percentages. So 22% of countries don't fund anything, which means that 78%. That's 122 countries to fund something, which means that it's not unusual for states to fund at least something. And then we have here a third of countries that robustly fund non-governmental schools. Robustly is everything that includes teacher salaries and more, because often teacher salaries is about half of the budget of a school. And so just to give you a little bonus as well, I think it's very important what Don mentioned just before, that there's a lot of misconceptions sometimes around freedom of education, what it is.
Sorry, before to go to that, because also the other end.
Okay. There's so much suspense. This is awesome. Yeah. Okay, great.
But now I think the good thing is, with the scrolling, we are getting used to all this change of topics really rapidly. Right? So we are also giving you this experience in person. So I'm going to give the floor to, I'm really sorry about these changes, to Harman Krul from Christian Democratic Appeal, also a pioneer of freedom of education.
I feel a little bit rude for intruding like this, but I promise I will keep it short, because most of what my colleague said, Don, is exactly how we, as the Christian Democratic Appeal, also view these things. There's a couple things I would like to add on that. And maybe let's start off by saying that we are very proud of this tradition, this heritage of educational pluralism, of schools with their own identity, their own stories, if you will, their own sense of purpose. But at the same time, we do not feel like there's much cause for celebration, because developments seem dire, and I would like to leave you with 2. One, from a political standpoint, there is a growing polarization within the debate on educational freedom. And this polarization is fueled by political parties, often liberal. I'm a politician, so I don't have to be politically correct about this. Often liberal parties who claim that there is no space for religion in the public square or in the public life. Now, we know in this room that educational pluralism and freedom of education is much more than just religion, but this is the very basis on which they found their criticism on. And we have yet to find the right answer on this polarization. And secondly, there's another threat, and that has to do with the neutrality, which Don also meant, and it has to do with the idea, the conception of some political parties that education is a system, a technocratic instrument that you can use to generate a certain standardized output. And they believe that if you apply compliance and control and efficiency and standardization, you can predict the output generated by the educational system. And if you don't get desired output, it means you have to apply more of it. So it creates a paradox, and that is very active at the moment. Where I would argue education is not some mixing console with knobs that the government can tweak and swivel and turn to get something they desire. They would argue that they just haven't found the right button yet. So we keep seeing more policies and more control, and it is slowly killing the pluralism within our system. So that is a big threat. So how real are these developments? Well, it's good to be among friends, and me and Dong, our parties are very much the same in this regard, but Dutch Parliament has 150 seats, and there are around 14 seats advocating for Article 23, which is the article in our constitutional law that protects the freedom of education. So we are fighting a losing battle at this point. So it's very good to have this dialogue today and see so many people from around the world advocating for the same cause as we do, and also see that we're actually doing really well. So what do I do? What do we have to do in the political arena? I would say two things. One, resist one-size-fits-all policies, because there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all education. That's just, well, leave it at there. And secondly, and this is very cliche but very true, it is dialogue. It is dialogue between government, between society and education. I feel that schools, institutions, they are modest by design, they want to be polite, but we should really let our voices be heard, because these threats are very real. And lastly, and then I'm just going to head off, because as well I have a debate at 10, which I probably am already late for, but that's okay. If we don't fight for these very important topics, I fear that the educational system will become a place where we only inform young children instead of transform them. Because schools need to be communities where values are passed on, where the futures of children's lives are shaped, and where stories are shared. And I also firmly believe, and that's why I want to see the cliffhanger and the correlations, because I would also argue that the places where this happens, the results are also better. So I will leave it at that, and then I wish you a very inspirational morning and a safe journey home.
Thank you very much. So, what you all have been waiting for? I'm gonna be short. It's just one more. There's one last point, because I think it is important, and it is. So we did this correlation report. So we took the Freedom of Education Index, the data, and then put it together with other indexes about social segregation, income distribution, and all that. And it helps us to, like mentioned before, to respond to some misconceptions. One of them being mentioned before, about that neutrality. I think that's a school being neutral. That's one of the misconceptions. Another one that we hear in several debates is one, and that's the one I'm going to zoom into, and the one on social segregation. There is this idea that where there's more freedom of education, societies are more segregated. There's this idea that everybody has in their little communities and nobody speaks with each other anymore, and society falls apart. And if that will be the case, then places with like the Netherlands that have very high freedom of education index, or Belgium would be basically falling apart, very high social segregation. In countries like the Netherlands, for example, there's a rather low freedom of education index, would have a very cohesive society. However, we cannot see any such correlation. So the point of you don't have to see all the detail. The point of here is that there's no line. So there's no what we can see here is that we don't see any correlation or between educational pluralism or social segregation. So what we can say is that this argument doesn't stand. It doesn't stand. So especially if that argument comes up whenever you are fighting in your place, you can show them our report and say that this is not the case. Just one add-on on this. This is also what we have seen. This is a new new indicator we added, the immigration gap, and here also what this means is that in places where there's more freedom of education, there's at least not a there's a smaller immigration. There's a smaller, or at least not a bigger immigration gap. So what it means is that it helps, or it can help, when there's more freedom of education, that the gap between locals and immigrants is smaller. And I mention that because I also know often where the segregation argument is being proposed, it's places where they care a lot about the immigration, or that people are being integrated. So again, this could be an argument, a useful argument for you. I'm not going to go in the other ones. And then here we have some links. If you want the Freedom of Education Index, that's up, or the correlation report, and everything is also on our website. And I didn't double check if I wrote "Thank you" all right. Yeah, I did. Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah. Okay.
And we are going to finish this roller coaster panel. I'm giving the floor to Mark Brooks with some closing remarks. Mark Brooks, as you know, is the president of Berus. And Mark, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us.
Oh, thank you. And let me start by saying a warm welcome to you. Welcome to the Netherlands, one of the homes of the freedom of education, as you've heard, and one of the homes of educational pluralism. And although that you already knew that when you came in, you probably thought two things when you came in. First of all, Dutch architecture, eh? What a great building this is, you thought when you came from the outside, this great mass of concrete. There's a reason for that. We're here in the former Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It also has a nickname, this building. The nickname is the Monkey Rock. So it's designed as a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so it's actually meant that you couldn't be found here. Even people who worked here weren't supposed to talk to each other, so it was a great setup for this building. So that's why it looks so grey and so a little bit gloomy. And the second thing you thought when you came in was, why is it easier to get on a plane in every airport or in the whole world than to get into this building? Why do we have to wait for 20 or 30 minutes? Well, this is the temporary building of our member of our House of Parliament. And we cherish our parliamentarians, as you saw this morning. But we also need to protect them, because also in the Netherlands there are a lot of threats against parliamentarians, and also there's a big polarization in our country. And that polarization hits home to the subject we're talking about today, educational pluralism, because it is my view that the polarization we have in the world is not a polarization between left-wing policies and right-wing policies, or a polarization between income, or a polarization between you name it. It's a polarization that has to do with openness. Are we open to hear and to listen to one another? Are we open to look each other in the eye, or are our hearts, are our eyes literally closed? And I think that more and more we see that the openness and the tolerance that also in the Netherlands we are very proud of is being lost. And when that is the case, it is very important that we have pluralism in our society, but especially in education, because when you're young, you are also taught about how the world looks and how you have to look at the world, how you have to look at life. And a pluralistic society and educational pluralism can contribute to see that there are other opinions, but also that your opinion is one to be heard, and that the views you have in life and the values you have in life are important, not just for you, but also for the people around you. But that there are also some people who might have other values. And that the thing is that we have to live with each other. When we don't see that, we close our eyes and we close our hearts, polarization will grow, pluralism will decrease. And I think the world wouldn't be a better place. So for us as Verus, an association of over 60% of all schools in the Netherlands, from primary schools to universities, over 60% of the schools are member of Verus, are Christian or Catholic. We see that there is something else asked of us in society than just teaching the good things. It's also about our values. It's also about human dignity as a central aim for education and for letting people grow up. That is why, for an example, last week our scientific council published a book on the harmful effects of meritocracy. It's called onderwijs voorbij de meritocratie. So you found out that this word means meritocracy. Onderwijs is education. So it's education beyond meritocracy. And it's about harmful effects, and 11 excellent scholars present proposals to shape education beyond meritocracy. It's one of the ways in which Freebirds tries to contribute to the political and social debate. And that is very much needed. And therefore, the international work of OIDEL is of great value, because we know that pedagogical freedom and educational pluralism lead to better learning outcomes. But not only that, it's important to strengthen that freedom. And we are thankful that we can do it together with you, with people who endorse the importance of these values. And I'm also very happy that we had 2 members of our Dutch Parliament with whom we work closely together here. Let us all cherish the wonderful place that the Netherlands has in the Freedom of Education Index, but let us also cherish the important work that we do. I'm glad that you are here, and I'm glad that we can help each other, advocating the role of educational pluralism in a society that hopefully opens hearts, minds and souls of young people all over the world. Thank you.
Good morning to everyone. My name is Josep Manuel Prats. I'm Secretary General of OIDEL, and I introduce 2 of our experts for today. I'm from Spain, from Barcelona, and also dedicated to parents associations in Catalonia, in Spain, and also in the European Parents Association, 40 years organization like OIDEL. Okay, let me introduce our first speaker, Niels Richke. I'm sorry, but Niels, thank you. He's a lawyer and social scientist. He obtained his PhD in Utrecht in November 2019 for his research into identity-based appointment policies of Orthodox Protestant schools in relation to human rights. Niels worked for the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research and for the Council of State, the advisory body of the Netherlands to the government and parliament. Niels is currently active as a legislative lawyer. As an expert in education policy, Niels gives a brief introduction to the Dutch freedom of education. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your kind words, for the invitation to speak on this symposium about educational pluralism, a very important topic to all of us, I think, in this room. So I was a legislative advisor at the Council of State, mainly advising on educational law. And like you said, now I'm drafting this legislation at the Ministry of Education. Important to note here is that I'm not participating here as in order to defend the position of the government in a sort of debate, but more in the capacity of an expert on this topic, describing and explaining the different developments in this field. And in my contribution today, I will focus on educational pluralism in the Netherlands from a legal and socio-legal perspective. I will give a broad overview of the way in which educational pluralism is enshrined in our constitutional system. It's also a topic of debate, as you already heard from our members of parliament, and I will discuss the developments in that respect. My focus in this presentation is on primary and secondary education. That's also the field that I know most about. I'm also actively working on legislation in this field, but to some extent the developments in those areas are also relevant for vocational and higher education. The idea of educational pluralism is at the heart of the constitutional provision on education in the Netherlands. Article 23 of the Constitution, as you already heard. The text of this article has hardly changed since 1917, the year of the so-called pacification between, on the one hand, liberals and socialists, and on the other hand, Orthodox Protestants and Catholics. Orthodox Protestants and Catholics were involved in a fight for equal payment by the government of private schools as compared to public schools. Since 1848, there was already the freedom to establish these private schools. However, there was a fight for these schools also to be subsidized on an equal footing with public schools. And you could already establish those schools based on a certain distinct ideology, meaning religion or worldview. And after 1917, these schools were also subsidized by the government. But in return for this subsidy, private schools have to live up to educational laws and regulations. These laws and regulations show respect the freedom of organization of private schools. The Constitution stipulates explicitly the freedom to choose teaching aides and to appoint teachers as they see fit. Next to this freedom of organization of private schools, there's also pedagogical autonomy for public schools, also important to note. Both private and public schools are nowadays almost always run by professional school boards as the competent and responsible authority to execute this freedom of education. Though the freedom of organization of private schools and the pedagogical autonomy of public schools can be limited by the government, as long as the requirements of proportionality, does it meet the goal, is it proportional in relation to the goal you want to achieve, and subsidiarity are met. And subsidiarity, are there alternatives for laws or regulations before you want to initiate this. And preferably these restrictions on the organizational freedom are laid down in the law and not in lower regulations. The government has also restricted the freedom of education in the past, justifying this on the basis of the governmental concern for the educational system, which is also stipulated in Article 23 of the Constitution. The general interest, rights and interests of parents, students and teachers are also mentioned to explain the restrictions on the freedom of school boards. This can be seen as a continuous balancing act, and the interpretation of Article 23 has also shifted over the years. This can be seen as a result of changes in society, such as secularization and individualization, as well as influences of European and international law, such as strengthened rights of non-discrimination and privacy. European and national legislation on non-discrimination and equal treatment has been the outcome of this, in which a balance has been struck between these conflicting rights. The right to equal treatment and privacy on the one hand, and on the other hand, the right to freedom of education, but also the right to freedom of religion. It can also be perceived as a balance between a more individual approach towards fundamental rights or a more collective component of fundamental rights, in which the individual rights have gained ground since, you could say, the 1980s. Next to that, the right to education has also come to play a more prominent role in these discussions. This right is stated, as you know, in international treaties that have been ratified also by the Netherlands, such as Article 2 of the First Protocol to the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 13 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, Article 28 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and Article 24 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The Constitution of the Netherlands is very open towards international law. It even makes explicit that international law is higher ranking than our Constitution. Hence, our Constitution has also to be interpreted in accordance with international law. On the advice in 2012 of the Dutch Education Council, the educational advisory body of the government, we should interpret Article 23 of the Constitution in such a way that this also implies the right to education. And currently there's also a proposal by the Dutch Green Labour Party in Parliament to stipulate the right to education explicitly in Article 23 of the Constitution, which also received a positive advice from the Council of State. The right to education, as laid down in international treaties, contains a right to access the educational system, as well as a right of parents to choose education in accordance with their personal religious or philosophical convictions. One could argue that both elements of this right to education are already implicitly part of Article 23 of the Constitution. Also because the government has to guarantee access to a public school in the surroundings. And there is room to establish schools on the basis of a certain ideology, giving parents collectively the opportunity to organize education for their children. According to international treaties, the right to education implies accessibility, availability, adaptability, and acceptability. There may be problems sometimes to access particular schools in the Netherlands for children with disabilities. These can be private or public schools. The right to education does not contain the right to access every single school, but the system has to be accessible. Even though educational and anti-discrimination law in the Netherlands prohibit discrimination on the basis of handicap, it can be quite difficult for children with disabilities when a school cannot provide the right amount of care. The Dutch educational system is also still a dual system, consisting of regular schools and special schools for children with disabilities. The lack of inclusive education was recently fiercely criticized by the UN Committee monitoring the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in its latest report on the Netherlands. If the Netherlands would ratify the optional protocol to this convention, it would also be possible for individuals and groups to claim a violation of this treaty at the UN Committee. And I think, Kathleen Ferrier will also tell more about diversity in education, and this is of course an example of this, but you will elaborate more on that topic. The other element of the right to education that I mentioned just before focuses on the convictions of parents. International law requires also the possibility to establish schools on the basis of these convictions. Recently, Dutch legislation has even broadened the opportunities to establish new schools, as long as there is enough interest among parents. They do not need to provide proof anymore that they belong to a certain distinct ideology in society. These ideological distinctions are also not so clear-cut anymore as they used to be. One could argue that this gives more room for educational pluralism in the Netherlands and for the freedom of education. However, the flip side of this enhanced freedom in this legislation is stricter scrutiny by the Dutch Inspectorate of Education before the school starts. This can be seen again as a restriction on the freedom of establishment of schools. Furthermore, the freedom of organization of private schools and pedagogical autonomy of public schools have been restricted already many times by laws and regulations on the basis of quality demands by government, and you could say also by society. Even though there is not such a detailed national curriculum as in other countries, the government does prescribe, in general terms, the subjects that need to be taught. Primary schools are required to take a test to advise children on the level of secondary education. There's a national exam at the end of secondary education. There are rules on minimum teaching hours, on the qualifications of teachers, on the internal oversight and the rights of personnel, on the admission of pupils, on obliged cooperation with other school boards for inclusive education, and many other subjects relating to the quality of education and the school organization. In recent years, requirements for civic education and school safety have been reinforced, which can not only be seen as a restriction on the freedom of organization by private schools in general, but for Orthodox religious schools also as a restriction on their freedom of ideology, for example on a topic like LGBT. Apart from educational law, there is non-discrimination legislation which restricts this freedom of Orthodox religious schools because of protecting the rights of individual teachers and students. It is still possible to allow teachers and students on the basis of adherence to a certain religion, but they cannot discriminate on other grounds such as gender or sexual orientation. Apart from these ideological issues and identity debates, there is a more general debate on the role of the Dutch government in ensuring the quality of education. and to enhance especially the lack of quality in certain parts of primary and secondary education. In the media, in society and politics, but sometimes also on demand by parents, students, teachers, or even schools themselves. There are often calls for more government intervention recently, and to restrict the freedom of schools in order to tackle these problems. For example, by taking more control over the education budget, instead of freedom of spending by school boards, or by stronger financial or punitive interventions by the inspectorate or the ministry when school boards make mistakes. And these discussions, as you heard, also by the MPs, are ongoing. As a conclusion, we do see a general shift in the approach towards and the interpretation of Article 23 of the Constitution. There's a more active national government which intervenes by laws, regulations, policies and subsidies, with the goal of enhancing educational quality, equal treatment and opportunity, the rule of law, as well as less polarization and more integration in society. Even though these goals may be understandable and laudable, this may cause tension with the freedom of education of private schools, as well as the pedagogical autonomy of public schools, and the underlying idea of educational pluralism, which for a long time has been a fundamental cornerstone of our Constitution. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Niels. Our next speaker will be Kathleen Verrier. She's the chair of the Dutch UNESCO committee. She is an expert in the field of development cooperation, human rights and diversity. Kathleen is affiliated as a lecturer at various universities in Asia and was a member of the House of Representatives for 10 years with portfolios including international cooperation, education, healthcare and social affairs. Today, Kathleen takes us along in the way in which UNESCO contributes to education in the Netherlands. She shows why the appreciation for pluralism is crucial today. Thank you so much. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. And first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to say a few words on behalf of the Netherlands Commission for UNESCO at this prestigious conference and on this very vital topic, educational pluralism. I also want to say welcome to the Netherlands, muy bienvenidos a todos a Holanda, and I want to say that your presence here is seen as a strong support, a needed support for educational pluralism. As you know, UNESCO is the United Nations educational, scientific and cultural organization, and our mission is to create peace in the minds of people. We believe that since ideas for wars start in the minds of people, it is also in the minds of people that ideas and desire and structures for peace, maintaining peace, can be constructed. And in times like these, and we experience that every now and then, it may seem naive to talk about creating peace in the minds of people, but we know that Nelson Mandela was absolutely right when he said that education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. Education is a lifelong journey, and habits, values, ideas, and attitudes acquired through education change lives, specifically and certainly if they are learned at a young age. Education is about knowledge, undoubtedly, but also about creating curiosity and connecting with others, and in the end, it is about understanding. Education changes the way people look at each other And most importantly, it can create trust amongst the people. Therefore, UNESCO invests in education around the globe. There is a strong network of 12,000 schools worldwide, schools that contribute actively to the mission of UNESCO. These are schools for primary education, secondary education, vocational and higher education. And here in the Netherlands, we are proud to have almost 80 UNESCO schools, public and non-public. And to give you an example of how these schools contribute to the mission of UNESCO, since the war started in Ukraine, UNESCO schools in the Netherlands, in Germany, and in Belgium work together with schools in Ukraine. And they not only work together, the pupils talk with each other, they see each other online, they experience the different circumstances. So they connect children in Ukraine with children in these countries, and also they connect refugee children in these countries from Ukraine with each other. And another example is of a UNESCO school in the southern part of the Netherlands that started a connection with a school in Indonesia to discuss our common colonial history. And by doing so, the students and their teachers, all from primary education, learned that one common past, the colonial past, can lead to totally different stories and insights and views and ideas because of the different perspectives from which this same history, colonial history, is viewed, is regarded. It is the same history, but told from totally different perspectives. And by doing so, UNESCO contributes to awareness, and to new awareness in general, and to new generations that are curious and that have an open mind for differences. People who are not afraid of differences, as many national here in the Netherlands and international leaders are these days, afraid for differences. But a generation that experiences that diversity is a strength, since it gives us the chance to combine different visions, values, ideas, and to use all creativeness we humankind have. That open mind towards diversity and pluralism is fundamental to the Dutch educational system, in which, as you have heard already, Article 23 in the Constitution guarantees equal public funding for both schools based on religious, ideological, and educational beliefs and public schools. Also, any citizen in this country has the right to found schools. So, one of the key features of the Dutch educational system is freedom of education. And we are grateful for your work, Oudel, and it is good to see that the Netherlands is still number 2 at the Freedom of Education Index. It means a lot, because as we have also heard from our MPs, freedom of education is not obvious here in the Netherlands, as it is about diversity and pluralism that is so much under threat. And it is about trust. Here in the Netherlands, we expect from our government to trust the parents and to give them the freedom to found the schools for their children in accordance to their religious, ideological, and educational beliefs. And of course, it is good to know how challenging still the situation is in so many countries, like you mentioned, Cuba, North Macedonia, and North Korea, for instance. so many countries facing so many challenges regarding the freedom of education. There is still a lot of work to do, and be sure that UNESCO is at your side. It's at your side to connect schools around the globe, to connect children, parents, teachers, students in many different parts of the world and many different circumstances. And all this to finally keep people curious, to stimulate knowledge and mutual understanding as the firm basis of trust amongst the people. Because it is only through trust that freedom can exist and grow. It is only through trust that we can work on creating peace in the minds of all people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. Well, just 2 words to say thank you so much for this inspiring first part of the seminar. And just remember one of the words George Haddad said, told yesterday, the human dignity, the concept of human dignity around the human rights and the freedom of education and pluralism. So we have